Is the presenter back there too? It works. Good. All right, the doctrine of creation is that this is God's act of creating. Out of nothing, basically, created the heavens and the earth, and then formed everything that exists in a span of 6 days. That's what 6 literal days of creation is all about. So what's the Bible say about it? God created the universe out of nothing. When he said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, out of nothing. The Latin would be ex nihilo. God created everything in 6 normal days, and his original creation was, at the end, when he got all done, what did he say? It was very good. All right, the 6 days God created, he separated light from darkness on day 1. He created the atmosphere and separated it from the oceans on day 2. He did dry land appeared and the vegetation was created on day 3. The sun, moon, and stars was created on day 4. This is the biggest probably change between creation, evolution, is when did the sun, moon, and stars happen? According to them, it happened at the very beginning with the Big Bang, okay? Whereas here it's on day 4. Birds and fish were created on day 5. Man and land animals were created on day 6, and then God took a day off. All right? Why do we have a 6-day work week? Why do we work 6 days, or on some people, less, but in any case, why do we have a 6-day work week and a day of rest? It's because of this. This goes right back to the very beginning. So on the first 3 days, God was making things. And then on the next 3 days, he was filling things. So everything that he made, he filled. He filled the heavens with the sun, moon, and stars. He filled the skies and the waters with birds and fish. And then he filled the dry land with animals and man. And then he took a day of rest. So he created the universe out of nothing. Why did he do this? To reveal his transcendent power. Reveal that he is God. Somebody who can make stuff out of nothing has got a lot of power. So man would be able to know him. He created all of this, and then he took and he created man. Everything else he created was after its kind. But then when he created man, man was created in the image and likeness of God, so that he could have fellowship with God and he could know who God was. I can't imagine what that must have been like for Adam and Eve the first time. But being who we are, we messed it up. So, whoa, what happened there? Okay, God created the universe. Hebrews 1, or 11, 1 through 3. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of the things which are visible. The things that we see were not made of the stuff that we see. That's the essence of what creation is all about. The things that we see around us were not made by the stuff that we see. They were made by a transcendent, all-powerful God who created them out of nothing. So why is faith important? Faith is trusting that what God has said in his word is true and accurate. That's what faith is all about. We believe God said it, and we believe it. If you don't believe it, then you don't have faith. If you're trusting in what you see to be faithful, you're not having faith. It's important that faith is believing what God said he did. And when we look around, we can see the evidence of what God has done. We can see what he has made, but that's not what we worship. Unfortunately, that's what most people do. They worship the creation, not the creator. They worship inanimate matter. They worship an unguided evolution process that starts us out from goo to us by way of the zoo. Goo to you by way of the zoo, I think is the way they put it. So we started out as some chemical soup, and out of that came the first living cell with all the organization and everything in it to be able to direct itself into something and create itself into something more. And eventually we worked our way up to where we are right now. But we are not the end of evolution. We're just a happenstance of evolution, if you believe that, all right? We are not the pinnacle, the tip of the spear, if you will. We're just a happy happenstance of something that happened, how we got here. That's what evolution will basically tell you. And what it tells you is there is no God. There is no way to get to God because there is no God. So faith is based on the reality of God's actions in history. How is it different from blind faith? Faith that you have, that God said what he did, you believe him, as opposed to blind faith, which is pretty much what you have to do to believe in evolution. You got to have faith that God created, but in evolution, you don't need faith. You just have to believe that all of this stuff happened through happenstance and millions of years and chance and evolutions and natural selection. Okay? The issue that you run into with that is that when you look at, quote, the science, when you actually look at the science, it can't happen. They've already looked and looked and looked, and they can't come up with any way for abiogenesis to happen, and that is that inanimate matter and chemicals can create life. They've already checked that out, and it doesn't work. They've looked at simple cells and fruit flies and things like this, and went through thousands and hundreds of generations with mutations and various and sundry things to see them supposedly working their way up. And almost in every chance, every time when you come up with some sort of a mutation, it's bad. The cell dies, the fruit fly comes out with legs growing out of its head and 6 wings or something like that, and it can't fly, and they die. And they've watched the mutations and stuff happen, and they find out that almost every case mutations are bad. Mutations don't allow you to get to something better. They end up killing the cell that's there. But probably the biggest problem with all of this is where'd the information come from? Because in order to build yourself up to something better, you got to have information already there in the cell to allow itself to change into something different. And if the information's not there, it's not going to happen. And that's probably the biggest issue that people have found is information theory. Information doesn't create itself. If it's not there to start with, you don't have it. And that's probably the biggest thing with biology is that if the information's not there, mutations are going to be bad and it's not going to help the cell at all. If it's not there, it's not there. And when you think about, we haven't got into the whole concept of what DNA and things like that is, the amount of information inside your one cell is staggering. We're talking like a whole library full of information inside one cell in your body, and there are hundreds and millions of cells in your body, each one having that information to allow it to reproduce and create a new cell just like what you had. You've got other cells, stem cells, that start out as something and they can turn themselves into something else because of the information that they have. When they look at the environment that they're in, they track that and provide information to create from that stem cell something else, a skin cell, a blood cell, a bone cell, these sorts of things. All right, but that information has to be there before that can happen. And if it's not there, it's not going to happen. And that is probably one of the biggest things that the scientists have been looking at, and they haven't found an answer for. How did it get where we are? All right. But the lie is still being told, and that's a shame, because it's not honest and it's not ethical. The power of faith comes not from the inside of a person, but from the dependability and the power of the person that you're trusting. So your faith doesn't come from you. It comes from the fact that you trust the God who said what he did is telling you the truth. Blind faith, on the other hand, is often irrational. When you think about blind faith, you're thinking about when people believe in evolution, that's blind faith. Because they're trusting in someone who can't do what's expected of them. When you look at the science, if you believe what these guys are saying, how evolution happened, you're putting blind faith in something that you already know doesn't happen. The scientists know it doesn't happen, and yet they still perpetuate the lie and people still believe it. That's blind faith. That's not faith in a God who said in the beginning, this is what I did. Think about Hebrews. By faith Abel, by faith Noah, by faith Abraham, by faith Isaac, by faith Joseph, by faith Moses, by faith Rahab, and Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also David and Samuel and the prophets. You read through, that's called the Hall of Faith. These guys all believed the God who said in the beginning, I made heaven and earth. Some of those people, the universe was created out of pre-existing materials. This is the lie, basically, that at the beginning in the Big Bang, nothing created everything, and here we are. There was nothing at the start, and then all of a sudden there was this massive explosion or expansion or whatever you want to call it. People have popularized it by the Big Bang. Most scientists don't like that term because they look at it and say, well, it wasn't an explosion, it was an expansion. An expansion of what? Of nothing. It was an expansion of nothing, and now we have everything. And it's kind of like, excuse me, it's too late for the watch, or the shoes save the watch kind of thing. That's basically what you're at when you start talking about how it was created out of pre-existing materials. Could it be true? Well, so far all of the experiments and all the testing and all the observation that they've done basically said, no. The author of Hebrews emphatically denied that this. God created what we see by the power of his word. Anyone who can create everything out of nothing has absolute power, and they should be absolutely trusted. But that's not exactly how we got to where we are today. So does the author of Hebrews mention, why does he mention all these people? Because they're examples of people who remain faithful to God and his word in difficult circumstances. We have the same thing today. We have difficult circumstances because if you believe that in the beginning God created, then you get laughed at, you get ridiculed. People say, you're just a religious fanatic. Anything that you have to say about science is we're just going to discount. And it's a hard row to basically hold down that row, because no matter how much you look at science, and there are people in various creation ministries, ICR, Institute for Creation Research, they're working on a biological model called environmental tracking, where you're looking at a creature, doesn't matter what it is. One of the things they're doing is blind cavefish. And they're saying, okay, these cavefish got into a condition where there's no light. And environmental tracking said, we don't need eyes then, and did away with the eyes. But if you bring them back into the light, they start redeveloping those. Scary thing, But they're looking at things where creatures are in a different environment, and they're tracking the environment they're in, and they're changing and adapting to that environment. And people are looking at that saying, wow, maybe this model is different than what we think. But that model directly contradicts the whole concept of evolution. Slow and gradual over long, long periods of time, things change. Well, things do change, but typically they don't change positively. So God related to his people in faith the way he did in the past, and he'll do the same thing in the present, and he does that today. These scientists are looking at things, and they're observing what God has said and what God is doing and adapting that to things in biology. They're looking at geology. When we start talking about the flood, more and more geologists are starting to look at what they see around them looking at the sedimentary layers and things like that and saying, we don't see any of that kind of stuff happening today. There must have been something massive in the past that laid all this stuff down. And they haven't quite come around to the concept of a worldwide flood, except that when they start seeing the same levels and the same types of stuff everywhere around them, it's kind of hard not to say that there wasn't some worldwide catastrophe. When they look and they see at coal seams and things like that, you don't see coal forming today, all right? And the places where they're looking for coal under thousands of feet of water, they're finding coal seams. Well, what happened? There was a valley there that all this vegetation got dumped into and then it got buried. They're looking at how long does it take for coal to form. It doesn't take millions of years to form. You can form it in a few months if you have the right temperatures and pressures. So they related, what God said he did in the past, he said he created, he judged sin. There was a worldwide flood. There was a big reset. Genetically, the biologists are looking and they can track that pretty much back to 3 people. Mitochondrial DNA, 3 individuals. Wonder who those 3 people were, those 3 women. The same thing with the animals. There's a big genetic bottleneck back about 4,500 years. And they could track that. Now you think about that and you say, well, what did God say in his word? How long ago did that happen? And when you think about that, and they're looking at this stuff and they're seeing it, it's amazing that they can't see what's right in front of them. But if you look at Romans, it'll tell you that this is why they can't see it, because they refuse to acknowledge the Creator. They worship the creation rather than the Creator, and so what has God done? He's blinded their eyes. And even when it's staring them in the face, they can't see it. And it's a shame, because there's a lot of people that are being told a lie that believe it. And when they come to meet their Creator, they're going to have no excuse. Because that's what it also tells us in Romans. There's ample evidence around, if you look, to see what God has done and what he said he was going to do. And if you don't believe it, then you're without excuse. So God created everything in 6 normal days. It provides a structure for time for man to live by. That's why we have a 6-day work week. There are other peoples in other places that tried doing different types of work weeks. They tried doing a 14-day work week. They tried doing a 10-day work week. And they always seem to go back to a 6-day work week, because the animals don't do well that way. Men don't do well that way. And when they got back to doing 6 days and a day off, it seems like people thrive. But when you try to do it more, they don't. Anybody worked? I used to work outages at the nuclear plant when we were refueling. And you didn't get much time off then. You basically worked 7, 8, 9, 10 days in a row, and then you'd get some time off. But people found that they were just getting worn out. And, I crashed a couple of cars by coming home and not even seeing the guy in front of me when I smacked him. And I have no idea, and I wind up on the other side of an intersection, and I have no idea what happened. And I stopped and had breakfast along with some coffee to make sure I got home. I didn't make it. So this sort of thing, God set it up because he knew what we needed. Time was made for man, not man for time. That is where we've got things all whacked around in our modern world, is that we think that, time is not for us, we're for that. It makes sense to have a fully functioning systems in a short time frame. Think about if the days were allegorized to be thousands of years or hundreds and millions of years. Think about, the vegetation without the sun. What would happen to it? If you take a plant and put it in the dark, it doesn't do too well after a couple of days without the sun. So you think about that, okay, well, what happens in millions of years? You got all the plants and vegetation, and you got no sun. You have a bunch of dead plants. Think about animals, without the vegetation, what's going to happen to them? They got nothing to eat. They're going to die too. So this whole concept of having it in a short time makes sense, because you got plants, they're getting ready to grow, and then you got the sun to help them grow. And then you got all the other critters that need those plants and they need the sun in order to thrive. And if you don't have that in a short period of time, it isn't going to work. So it's got to be a short period of time. So let's talk a little Hebrew now, okay? We're going to talk about the word yom. In the Old Testament, it's when a Hebrew word for day appears with evening or morning or modified by a number. It always means a 24-hour day. So when we look at Genesis, chapter 1 and chapter 2, what's it say? And the evening and the morning were the first day. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And it just keeps on going down through that. And if you do the standard understanding of that, that means a literal 24-hour day. And it's very hard to try and insert a long age of time between Genesis 1 and 2, which is what most people try to do with the gap theory and things like this, to say that between Genesis 1 and 2 there was millions of years of time that went on before God did anything else. After he created, the heavens and the earth, there was all this long time of everything going on and evolution and everything else before we got to the point where he started doing things again. So basically, he started things going and then he went and took off and went on vacation for a while and then came back and said, oh yeah, it's time to start doing some other stuff. And that just, it's hard to put that in there. But a lot of people have, because they want to believe the lie, because they want to appear to be intelligent. And if you say, no, it was just 6 literal days, people laugh at you. So that happens every place else except in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is where all this stuff happens, and it said in the evening and the morning were. So you got evening, morning, and a number. And every place else in the Old Testament where Yom occurs, when you got that, they're talking about a literal 24-hour day, except in Genesis 1. And you can't have that because you've got to have 6 days for what God said, but we can't have the 6 days because we need the millions of years. So we got to find some place to put that in. So why it's important? If the days of creation are really geologic ages of millions of years, then the gospel message is undermined right at its very foundation. Because if the Bible doesn't say what God said it said at the very beginning, then what else did God not say? What else is not true? If Genesis 1 isn't true, then why should Genesis 2 be true? Why should Romans be true? Why should any of the Gospels be true? Why should the whole concept of what Christ did for us be true? Why should the concept of sin be true? Why should the concept of judgment be true? If you can't believe the Bible from the first verse, then why should you believe the Bible at all? All right, so this undermines basically the entire concept of the Bible right from the very beginning. And that's Satan's game plan. Think about what happened in Genesis. Genesis chapter 3. What was the big lie? Did God really say? Did he really say that you're going to die if you eat from this fruit? There's the big lie right there. Did God really say? Causing you to think about, maybe this isn't true. And he's still running that play. The reason he keeps running that play is because it works. He starts out getting you to distrust God, and then he says, well, maybe this isn't what God said. Maybe you'll be like him, knowing good and evil. You're going to be like God. See, that's what man really wants to be. He wants to be his own God. And the lie works because man believes it. It puts death, disease, thorns, and suffering before the fall. If you start out with a big gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, so that you can put all of this stuff in there, the fossil record shows, lots and lots of death, first off. That's what fossils are. They're dead things that were buried. All right? When you examine some of those, you'll find evidence of cancer, evidence of bone disease, evidence of other things, evidence of carnivory. Uh, when you look at this, you got death, disease, you got thorns and suffering and everything else going on before Genesis 2. And if that's the case, if you define days as geologic ages, it results in an erroneous approach. You reinterpret the Word of God on the basis of fallible theories. And that's what basically has happened in many of the churches. Churches that believe in long ages, they have a concept what they call theistic evolution or something like that, where God used evolution as his means of creating. If God's really all-powerful, what's he need to do that for? He doesn't need to take millions of years for a protozoa to develop into a person. Because basically what he said he did was he made man in his own image and likeness. He created all the animals after their kind. He didn't have to wait millions and millions of years to do that. He did it with his word. So did God really say, this is the lie? The days have been allegorized to mean long ages. And it's a shame, but that's the way it is. That's what people have done. And it didn't necessarily start with Charles Darwin. There was other things. When we start talking about speciation and things like that, you're going to see that it started back with Aristotle. There was a commendation to allow various forms of evolution to be written into the Bible. And what happens if you got two competing theories, and you got one, and you're trying to merge them together, guess which one gets modified? It's not the theory of evolution, it's the Bible that gets modified. So God really did say there was evening and morning. There was a number. And all are normally interpreted to mean a normal solar day, except in Genesis 1, where it's not. So in the beginning, according to scientists, you have a big bang 13.8 billion years ago. About 13 billion years ago, stars are forming. The sun formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Early Earth, first oceans, and early life, not known when. Somewhere between 3.8 billion and now is early life. You think about that. How does that contrast with what God had to say? Day and night, the atmosphere, the oceans, plants, sun and moon after plants, birds, sea creatures, all right, completely out of whack. So in order to accommodate this, you got to put long ages of time here and also in here. This has got to be back over here. And when you just look at, all the things that got to happen, Genesis 1 just doesn't exist anymore if you try to put this in there, because it's all out of order and it's all got long ages attached to it. And that's a shame, because the Word of God, if you look at it, it reads pretty straightforward. It says there was a day, there was another day, there was a third day, there was a fourth day, evening and morning and a number. Every place else in the Bible except Genesis 1, you would interpret that as a literal 24-hour day. So we look at the verses. It says, and there was the day he called day and night. And there was morning, first day, evening and morning, the second day, evening and morning, the third day, which is what we talked about. If you go through that, there's no question that it was a literal day, except if you got to try and harmonize that with the theory of evolution in millions of years. So it created everything in 6 days. And this is the testimony of that. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. The rest of the Bible has no question about what God said he did. Jesus reinterpreted, he basically quoted this. He believed it, and God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So even morning were the sixth day. This is what God said about his creation. He didn't say that you had to worry about disease and thorns and millions of years and everything else. He said when he got done, he said he looked at what he had made and he said it was very good. And that was at the end of 6 days. So what does this verse tell us about the nature and purpose of God's creation? It was created not only for the benefit and use of man, but for all living creatures. It wasn't just for man. Man was created to have dominion over the rest of God's creation, but also to have fellowship with him. All right? So that's, and to be able to appreciate what God has done by what he provided for him. He provided him a garden, he provided him work, he provided him a soulmate. And so you had man and woman. He provided them a place where they could live and they could have fellowship with him. I can't even begin to imagine how cool that must have been. But it wasn't probably too much long after that Satan came in and told them the lie, and they believed it. And we have been paying the price ever since, because we're all sinners. We're all born with a nature that wants us to be in charge, not God. And because of that flaw, if you will, we're all sinners. Because of that, we all need a Savior, because the wages of sin is death. And we all deserve to pay that penalty, but God in his love sent Christ to pay that penalty for us so that we don't have to, if we trust in him. See, I've given you every herb that yields seed which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seeds. So you will be for food, and to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the air, and everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. That was the beginning. We were all vegetarian, including the animals. So when you look at today's world, it's very different. We have a world where there's death, disease, carnivory. A world without natural evil was what it was originally. It didn't have carnivory. So when we think about what God did, every place else in the Bible, a day is, if it's got day, evening, or a number, it's a 24-hour day, except in Genesis 1. We can't have that if you believe in evolution, because there's no time for evolution to have occurred if it was 6 literal days. Especially since if we look at other things and time markers, we're not all that old. About 6,000 years, 7,000 years maybe. And there's no time for evolution to have occurred if we're that young. And you can't have that if evolution has occurred. For evolution to have occurred, you've got to have long ages. You've got to have millions of years. And so if you try to harmonize the Bible with evolution, guess what gets modified? It's not evolution that gets modified. It's the Bible that gets modified. And that's basically what we've seen happen. The church has compromised with the scientists, and so the 6 days can't be believed anymore. You can't have that and still have evolution. Now, one of the other things that we were going to talk about is variety within created kinds. If you look in the Bible, God repeats this phrase 10 times in Genesis 1. Verses 11 and 12 for plants and trees on day 3. Sea creatures and flying creatures on day 5. Land animals, cattle, beasts, and creeping things on day 6. So 10 times in those verses, he said it was created after its kind. And so you got to think about what's a kind. In Hebrew, once again, we're going to do a little bit, it's called min. Masculine noun indicating a kind of species. It indicates an animal or something that shares common characteristics, and it's not equal with the modern scientific definition and the use of species. And then you got another thing called bara, meaning to create. Only God is the subject of this verb. It's used for creating let there be. So when you think about the Hebrew, you're looking at bara min, a created kind. So what's a created kind? This is the classic way to classify animals and creatures and things like that in science. You start out with a domain, a kingdom, a phylum, a class, an order, a family, a genus, and a species. This is not the created kind in Genesis. All right, so you got, at the beginning domains, you got archaea, bacteria, eukaryotes. Then you get down into the kingdom, you got archaea, bacteria, fungi, protists, animals, and animals. And as you keep going down, you start getting into mollusks, arthropods, and vertebrates. Oh, okay, so you're getting down to things that have backbones. Cartilaginous fish, bony fish, and tetrapods. Those are land-type animals. Amphibians, amniots. Amniots are things that have an egg, if you will. Okay, so now we're getting down a little bit closer. Birds, reptiles, and mammals. Okay, we're down in here. Marsupials, monotremes, and placentals. Placentals, those that have a placenta. All right, that's a, if you will, a womb. And finally, you get down to where man is. So he's kind of a eukaryote, an animal, a vertebrate, a tetrapod, an amniote, a mammal, placental, and a man. That's where you are. We're down here. But the created kind is probably up closer to this. Family. All right? Now, when you think about it, these are the kingdoms. And then you get to this. Now this is, if you open a standard biology book, typically you'll see this tipped on its end, and you'll start down here at the base, and this is the tree of life, if you will. All right, but basically how you get through the various classifications. So you got the eukaryotes, animals, vertebrates, tetrapods, mammals, and finally down here to placentals, all right, where man is. All right, that is a scientific way of classifying things, but it kind of has this whole concept of everything started out down here as one cell. So, but in the types of kinds, you have different types of dinosaurs. You've got hadrosaurs. These are plant eaters that basically walk sort of on 2 feet, but they use their forelimbs to either for grasping things or for walking sometimes. You got different types of ceratopsians. Those are like, the one that's most famous is Triceratops, but you see that they all have this big frill and various types of horned ornaments, but they're all ceratopsians. So that's a kind, if you will. All right, flying reptiles, that's also a kind, pterosaurs. You see kind of the same general shape. Some things are a little bit more exaggerated than others, but basically the same sort of thing, a flying type reptile. All right, you have bats, that's a kind. Flying mammals. And you have bird kinds, different kinds of birds. And then you have, well, got to get to the dog kind first. All right, so you get to the dog kind. And you have different kinds of dogs, wild dogs, foxes, jackals, wolves, coyotes, dingoes, raccoon dogs, bush dogs. All of these are different kinds of dogs. They're all dogs. You can't have, we got to give equal time to the cats, since a lot of people like cats. To me, cats are the crabgrass on the lawn of life. Snoopy, you're a good man, Charlie Brown, okay? I didn't invent that, he did. All right, but cat kind includes things like tigers and lions and jaguars and leopards and bobcats and lynxes and cougars and ocelots and caracals and domestic cats, okay? But they all have a lot of the same characteristics. You ever watch your cat go into stalk mode? Okay? Tigers do the same thing. Okay? They go into stalk mode. Cheetahs do the same thing. They go into stalk mode. And your domestic cat. In fact, actually, I think the domestic cats were listed as the #1 killer in the United States. All right? Birds, mice, other sorts of things. The cats in our neighborhood are really good. We don't have an issue with rats or mice in our neighborhood, but they're not real successful at catching birds. At least, not that we've been able to see very often. So, but they're all the same kind of creature. It's a cat of various types. Okay? So how do we get away from the biblical species, which is men today? This is how we got to be where we're at, and we're already almost out of time, so we're going to go quick. The false idea of fixity starts back in ancient Greece with Aristotle, that everything that you see today was the way it was at the beginning. All right? And according to this view, each species was created precisely the same as we see it today. So that's the concept of fixity of species. By the 17th century, this concept of immutability had become linked to the belief in separate creation. Swedish botanist Linnaeus was famous for laying the foundations for modern biological science, and he said, we count as many species that were created in forms at the beginning. So everything that he was looking at today, he says, that's the way it was at the very beginning. And that's not the way that we see it. God created things according to their kind. And since then, with all that genetic information, we see speciation happening. For example, you look at the different types of dogs, the different types of cats, and that sort of thing. So we got away from that. Darwin showed how the fixity of species ran counter to the evidence that he'd been collecting. His book managed to convince most scientists that species weren't fixed or unchangeable. The early Latin translators of the Bible used the term species and genus for the Hebrew word min to denote created kinds, a baramin, if you will. And there was a bait and switch that occurred in the mid-1800s when the species was redefined at a lower level than the scientific classification that was previously understood by the church and the public. This is where things got off track. There was an error that already existed in the church saying that species didn't change, that they were fixed, and they were fixed from the day of creation, which is not true. That was the Aristotelian Greek philosophy thing. So many denominations rejected the fixity by either definition, whether it was the upper definition of species, min, or the lower definition scientifically. And they began to adopt evolutionary beliefs, particularly theistic evolution. By observing changes in species using the new definition, they rejected the concept of fixity within species by the old definition, and they walked away from the church because they compromised with it. This redefinition coincided with the rising theory of evolution, the changing of the new definition of species. People challenged the biblical teaching of fixity within species, which is the different kinds, as opposed to the concept of fixity being that everything that was created at the beginning is still here today, which is not necessarily true. So what do? We need to challenge both the unbiblical essentialist ideas that underlie the species fixity and the naturalistic ideas that underpin evolution from a common ancestor. Truth lies somewhere in between these two extremes. There are kinds that were created. There was a dog kind, and we see that today, different types of dogs. There was a cat kind, different types of cats. Different types of kinds of dinosaurs, different types and kinds of different types of land animals and creeping things. Those started out with a lot of genetic diversity in them, and that diversity was necessary so that they could repopulate the world without running into problems with inbreeding and things like that, which we see today when you start inbreeding different types of things into dogs and cats and stuff like that, and you inbreed into them genetic problems. Think about different types of dogs, all right? And what do you have problems with? Things like hip dysplasia in various types of dogs. Well, that's a result of all the inbreeding that's been done to get you a golden retriever or things like that. Those dogs, while very popular and very friendly, have a serious problem with hip dysplasia. That's a result of loss of genetic information because the kinds had a bottleneck back at the flood. All right? Species, using the lower definition, they do change. But variation has clear limits. You don't see dogs changing into something else. You don't see cats changing into something else. You see different types of cats, Persians and all these kind of other creatures. You see all these different kinds of dogs, but they're still dogs. That's basically where we want to end. All right? Is you look at all the different types of dogs, you got, Great Danes and Mastiffs at one end, and you got Chihuahuas, spawn of the devil, on the other end, okay? So, but they're still dogs. All right? And that's where we want to end with. God created in 6 days. He created specific kinds of creatures. And that's pretty much the end of the first day that we're going to be talking about, first things. So